Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone and welcome back to this lecture series on aluminum based alloys and metal matrix composites. So right now we are talking about grain refinement by melt inoculation, which involves addition of a grain refiner into the melt for it to act as heterogeneous nucleation sites and lead to grain refinement. And in the previous lecture, if you recall, we started talking about the mechanism of grain refinement in this process. Okay, so with regard to the mechanisms of grain refinement by melt inoculation, we have talked about these two, the carbide boride theory and the peritectic theory. The next one that we have is the peritectic hulk theory. So what we have seen so far, the heterogeneous surface is primarily provided by these aluminide particles. Right? So in order for them to act as the nucleating sites, the dissolution of these particles has to be prevented. So this peritectic hulk theory suggests that the presence of the TiB2 particles will help in preventing this dissolution, because these particles will form a shell around the Al3Ti particles, and that is how, with the help of this shell or the hulk which forms around the particles, around the Al3Ti particles, their dissolution can be prevented for them to act as the heterogeneous surface for the nucleation. And as the process proceeds, eventually the Al3Ti particles will dissolve, leaving behind a liquid of composition close to the peritectic composition, inside the boride shell. Right, so the boroid shell that forms that essentially slows down the dissolution of Al3Ti particles so that it can act as a nucleating surface till a particular period of time, and eventually once the grain refinement has happened, this will dissolve, leaving behind a liquid of approx peritectic composition inside the boroid cell. Now there are some limitations for this theory as well. For this to be true, the formation of this cell over the Al3Ti particles, the grain refining efficiency should decrease with increasing number of melting and solidification cycles. Okay, so if you do this a number of times, that is melting and then again solidifying it, then the grain refining efficiency should decrease with increasing number of melting and solidification cycles. As this will allow the diffusion of titanium out of the hull. As you do it a number of times, as you increase the number of cycles, titanium will diffuse out. And that will prevent the peritectic reaction. And if this reaction is prevented, the grain refinement efficiency will also come down, because we have seen before that the grain refinement occurs through this peritectic reaction. But experimentally, it has been shown that the grain refining efficiency does not really change as you increase the number of cycles, right? So that is how it is difficult to explain the nucleation with the formation of such cells. Okay, and the other thing is the fact that this theory also cannot explain recovery after fading through stirring of the melt. So what happens in a process like this, when the particles are acting as the heterogeneous surface, if you allow sufficient time, these particles will tend to settle down. Okay, and as we have discussed before, for the particles to act as the heterogeneous nucleating surface, they have to be suspended in the liquid metal, right? So if they settle down, then the grain refinement efficiency will decrease, and that is a process known as fading, as if the grain refinement efficiency of the process is fading out. So if you do some kind of stirring in the melt, if you start the melt, physically, then these particles will be again suspended into the melt and the grain refinement will recover. Okay. So this theory cannot really explain that recovery by stirring. That is the other limitation of the peritectic Hulk theory. The next one that we have in line for these mechanisms goes by the name hypernucleation theory. So this theory says that elements like titanium tend to segregate at the boride melt interface. So when you have this aluminium, titanium, boron ternary master alloys, you have Al3Ti aluminides as well as the boride particles, and titanium in that case would tend to segregate along this boride liquid metal interface. Okay, and due to that, the mobility of the aluminium atoms in the liquid will be restricted. And this will lead to formation of what is called as pseudocrystals. By a templating kind of effect. Let me explain that to you with the help of a diagram which I already have over here. This is the titanium atom. Which is segregated around the boride melt interface. Okay, and due to the presence of such segregated titanium, the mobility of the aluminium atoms that you have in the liquid will be restricted, and as a result of that, they will try to take up a structured form like how you have in solid crystals. Although there is no long range order as such in case of liquid, but due to the presence of such atoms, the mobility of the atoms in the liquid around it will be restricted, and they will try to take up a structure which is close to alpha aluminium, and that is what we call as the pseudocrystal. Okay, so the atoms around it, for example, atoms like this one, are all fixed in place and their mobility is restricted. So this type of atoms will be called as the atoms fixed by titanium atoms. So these are the aluminium atoms fixed by titanium atoms. And then if you see the other atoms around it, such as these ones, their mobility is also restricted, So it will extend to some layers into the liquid. The maximum range of that is actually delineated by this outline over here. So that is the probable extent of the restrained interfacial atoms. If I look at this entire outline shown in green color, this is the probable extent of restrained interfacial atoms. And this outline that you see over here that is the conceivable maximum extent of the stabilized region. In which the aluminium atoms are fixed. Okay. So with the help of such fixation, this liquid around the titanium atoms will take up a structure which is close to the structure of the solid. And that is why, this can now act as the nucleus as you lower the temperature below the liquidus temperature or the melting point of aluminium. This will grow as the nucleus, right? Because this has already got the structure of the solid aluminium, right? So now that you are lowering the temperature and there is more driving force for the atoms to arrange in a particular structure, these pseudocrystals themselves can now act as the nucleus and grow in size. Okay. So that is how, with the help of such elements which can segregate along the interfaces, along the boride and melt interfaces, the nucleus can form with the help of the pseudocrystals. So now if you look at any section around, let's say around this plane, if you take a cross section around AA, you would find something like this. So this is basically the TiB2 surface. And here the titanium atom has actually diffused to this interface between the boride and the melt. Okay, so this is the titanium atom, right? And with the help of this segregated titanium, the atoms around it are all fixed, the aluminium atoms. We will follow the similar notation as before. This will be aluminium atoms, probably restricted in mobility, that is in the outer layer, okay, with a single dash that you see. And when you have this double dash, that indicates aluminium atoms located by the fixed core. Same notation is followed over here also. So this outer layer that you have here now, that is the same outer layer that you see in the previous diagram as well. Same for this also. Right? So up to certain layers in the liquid metal, these atoms are fixed in place due to the segregation of titanium to this interface, and this takes up the form of a pseudo crystal having a structure which is very close to the solid aluminium. So as you lower the temperature below the liquidus, this will grow as nucleus. Since it has already got the structure which is close to the solid aluminium. And the other thing to note over here with regard to this hypernucleation theory is the fact that elements having similar size to aluminium will actually promote this hypernucleation. The size of titanium, the atomic radius of titanium is very close to aluminium, and that is why titanium is effective in promoting the hypernucleation. Okay, so if you look at the size of titanium, it's very close to aluminium, which is 0.053 nanometer. Okay. On the other hand, elements which are very different in size will prevent the hypernucleation process. So elements like zirconium, chromium have very different size, and therefore they will prevent hypernucleation. So let me summarize the different mechanisms that we discussed today. So today we have talked about the following mechanisms: the carbide-boride theory, which says that carbide or boride particles are present as the heterogeneous surface for aluminium to nucleate. Then we talked about the peritectic theory, which says that there is a peritectic at a particular titanium concentration and temperature, and the alpha aluminium which forms due to this peritectic reaction actually acts as the heterogeneous surface for nucleating the aluminium when the temperature is lowered below the equilibrium melting point. And then we talked about the peritectic Hall theory, which suggests that there is a shell of boride which forms around the Al3Ti particles, and this actually delays the dissolution of these particles, because for any particle to act as a heterogeneous surface, it has to be stable and it should not dissolve. So in order to delay or prevent the dissolution of these Al3Ti particles, a shell of TiB2 particles forms around it, and that's how it makes it an effective nucleating surface by preventing its dissolution. And then finally we talked about the hypernucleation theory, which says that elements like titanium can segregate at the boride melt interface, and due to that the mobility of the aluminium atoms around these segregated titanium atoms will be restricted in the liquid, and as a result of that these atoms will tend to take up a structure which is very similar to the structure of solid aluminium. So this will act as a template for solid aluminium, and this structure is called as the pseudocrystal, which will finally act as the nucleus as the temperature is lowered below the liquidus temperature. So these are the different theories that we have discussed today in this particular class. There is one more to come, but that will be taken up in the next class. Okay. All right. With this, we can wind up this lecture today. There are few more things on this topic which we will take up in the next lecture. Keep watching.